So, hello, everybody. I'm Brett Kaufman, the organizer of this conference. Thank you very much for being here. I'm an archaeologist and a specialist in ancient and modern Semitic languages, some of which I learned from our speaker, Frank Salome, which means I have the great privilege of spending a lot of time studying the history of the Middle East and its various peoples. I study how elites or leaders across space and time use ideologies and shared rituals and taboos to manipulate people into following them, which is, I think, useful in understanding some of what we've been seeing on campuses across the country, including our own. I had the idea for this conference in the weeks following the Hamas attacks of October 7th. To provide some context, those attacks involved the invasion of 3,000 terrorists from Gaza into southern Israel, who went on a rampage of murder, rape, violent genital mutilation of girls and women, the burning of babies, and the taking of civilian hostages. Denial of these events has become commonplace on campuses across the United States, even though the terrorists themselves documented their crimes against humanity extensively via body cams and recordings. Almost immediately, voices on campus across America and Europe called out with condemnation against Israel, against Jews, in other words, blaming the victim. A colleague recently asked me who was my target audience for this conference and what were my goals. I told her the target audience are curious people who are seeking facts about a conflict that is historically complex, who have a suspicion that widespread propaganda supercharged by social media is a potential problem in attempting to find a solution, who are interested in scholarly conversation, conversation, not just about Middle Eastern policy, which is the typical approach on campuses regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict, but rather a deep dive into our own home, the university campus, where one of the defining conflicts of our time has come into dramatic focus. Who are wondering why it is that the majority of Jews in mainstream Jewish organizations have been saying more and more that it feels to us that for the first time in our lives, it feels like the 1930s. My goals? For the speakers to be able to present their research and opinions and analyses freely, and most importantly, that no one gets hurt. That no one gets hurt. Like at Berkeley on February 26, where a violent mob attacked and rioted at a talk simply because the speaker was an Israeli Jew, and the attendees had to be evacuated out of the venue. She said to me, what a time we're living in, that the goal of an academic conference is that no one gets hurt. So that's what we're going to explore today. How did we get here? This is not a conference on anti-Semitism on the University of Illinois campus alone, but it is also that. And much of the material I present may be difficult to hear and see, but this is a conference on anti-Semitism, and sugarcoating or suppressing facts is a disservice to the entire academy, no matter the topic. There are many excellent researchers and organizations tracking anti-Semitism on campus. I'll be presenting some of their aggregate data while also highlighting specific instances or case studies of anti-Semitic behavior that relate to our campus, or using examples from other campuses so I can share my analyses and interpretations of overall trends. I will also pepper in some facts about the conflict in the Middle East, facts that may temper some of the fanaticism that we've been seeing in newly initiated campus activists. Although I will make mention of some organizations, I anonymize faces and names of people who I mentioned by and large, and even entire academic units, because my point today is not to focus on personal identities, but to provide examples that highlight the misguided, hateful, and false words and deeds that represent the societal processes behind the Jew hatred we have been witnessing. I submitted my proposal for this conference the same week that the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn finally found their love of free speech in front of Congress once it came to protecting calls for violence against Jews. And it is finally taking place today as institutions of higher education across the country have witnessed over the past 2 weeks chants of death to America, death to Israel, and messages of love for Hamas requesting they target Jewish students with their rockets, as seen here at Columbia. Last week in their Gaza Solidarity encampment, our own students passed out flyers calling for, quote, militant direct action, end quote, and circulating a handbook on how to assault police officers to free an arrestee. The students then went on to fight physically with UIPD. Our local chapter of UIUC Faculty for Justice in Palestine, or FJP, wrote, quote, we support our students' courage and conviction in their commitment to struggle, end quote. It's hard to imagine this conference being timelier, and I'm pleased that all of you came and that all of you who are tuning in and are taking this seriously enough to hear my perspective and those of our speakers. Today, I will ask a series of questions that I observe to be lacking at institutions of higher education in light of students calling for the destruction of the state of Israel, the ethnic cleansing of its Jewish population and Jews everywhere, as we see here in this image taken on October 28th at our alma mater. A colleague told me they didn't think this image is anti-Semitic, just anti-Israel. Just clean the world of Israel, the only Jewish state where half the world's Jews live. Throw them in the trash. So apparently that makes it okay. But if we observe the vagueness associated with the symbols, the Star of David, which has been a symbol of Judaism for more than 1,000 years, with no explicit mention of Israel at all, then it's clear that this poster invites both meanings. For anti-Zionists to tell themselves they're not being anti-Semitic and cling to the belief in their own impartiality no matter what, it walks the line. But for most Jews, it's terrifying. This person is smiling, a young person, calling for the ethnic cleansing of Jews not just from Israel, but from the entire world. It is often stated that Jews and Muslims got along just fine until the State of Israel was created in 1948, as if it was the fault of Zionism that so many Jews were murdered and expelled from Arab lands, a topic Helene Silverman will address today. This position ignores the centuries of Jews and Christians being subjugated under Islamic law as second-class citizens or ahl al-dhimmi. It ignores history. This brings us to an important question that we need to address right off the bat. Does hatred of Israel equal hatred of Jews? Are calls for the destruction of the state of Israel anti-Semitic, or are they legitimate commentary on American foreign policy? Where is the line? The other related issue is, do those who hate Israel or Jews even care about being labeled anti-Semites anymore? And Frank Salome will be discussing the terminology around the word Semite later. To illustrate this, I'd like to read a social media post of a professor at the university from this semester, spring of 2024. Quote, "I'm not tolerating anyone who defends Israel. The idea that Jewish people are being oppressed or attacked for pro-Zionist views," end quote, a position they call bullshit. More telling, this was the post the professor wrote in celebration of receiving tenure. The abuse of tenure was immediate. No wonder much of the public has lost trust in higher education. What is Zionism? Zionism starts with the premise that Israel is the ancestral homeland of the Jews for the past 3,000 years. It continues with the assertion that in the age of modern nation states, the sovereign Jewish one should therefore be in Israel. The desire of Jews to live in Zion is attested for millennia from the Babylonian exile of 586 BC, and especially since the Romans enslaved and exiled many of Israel's remaining Jews in the Second Jewish Revolt of 136 AD, bringing many of them in Europe to Europe in chains, although there always persisted at least small communities of local Jews in Israel. A longing to return to Zion is an integral part of Judaism, and this was recast in the 19th century as a national movement as the concept of the nation state spread across the world. In response to these archaeological, epigraphic, historical, and genetic facts, anti-Zionists have rewritten history and assert debunked conspiracy theories that Jews, in fact, have no connection to Israel, but are a modern invention. And because of the fact that so many Jews returned to Israel from Europe, that their renewed presence is equal to a European white settler colony. This ignores the circumstances under which many arrived, fleeing the pogroms and Holocaust and mass expulsion from Arab countries. They also claim that Zionists do not speak on behalf of all Jews. But the fact is, the vast majority of Jews are Zionists. A December poll by the Israel on Campus Coalition found that support for Israel's campaign to free the hostages in Gaza cut across partisan lines, with 84% of Jewish Democrats and 87% of Jewish Republicans backing the Israeli right to self-defense. Frequent faculty op-eds or tweets that decry that Zionism is not a part of Jewish identity are a minority, a fringe voice, that are mostly concentrated, you guessed it, on campuses. The average Jew is terrified of anti-Zionist hatred and considers it discriminatory. Surely, American taxpayers have a right to express opinions on international affairs. But what happened 2 weeks ago in Chicago is not that. A speaker at a conference co-sponsored by a UIC student organization taught the crowd to chant "Death to America" and "Death to Israel" in Farsi, in support of Iran's attack on Israel. Now, it's a legitimate scholarly question if the model of the nation state writ large should exist at all, or if we can find perhaps another less divisive model for humanity. But to single out only one nation state, not North Korea, not Afghanistan, not Russia, not Iran, with all of their well-documented institutionalized human rights abuses, but only the democratic state of Israel, which is the only country with legal protection for LGBTQ plus people in the entire Middle East, a country where equal rights for women are so ingrained that from 2006 to 2009, the Israeli Prime Minister, Supreme Court President, and Speaker of Parliament were all women, and which is such distinctly not an apartheid state that Palestinians serve in the parliament, judiciary, and even the Israel Defense Forces, a topic which our speaker Khalifa will address in his speech coming up next, then yes, to single out Israel for criticism, and only Israel, denying all of its humanitarian bona fides, is anti-Semitic. Aside from some Jewish extremists, which every culture or religion has, the majority of Jews and all the mainstream Jewish organizations agree with me. Anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. So I'd like to pose several questions. We won't be able to answer them all today, but there are questions that desperately need to be asked. And I'll address each very briefly, so you don't need to crane your neck reading the whole thing right now. I'll read them out loud too. And I encourage you, if you find these questions upsetting, especially if you find them upsetting, let's have a conversation about it, something that the Vice Provost mentioned, because perhaps something I say could be improved upon or refined or clarified in a way that I didn't consider. And if you propose that to me and I admit it, that is scholarship. That is the scientific process, iterations and improvements, discussion, dialogue, faithful presentation of actual facts, not dogma, fixation, entrenchment, censorship, and screaming. We owe it to our students to welcome facts back into our discourse and discourse back onto campus. If we can't teach our students to talk to each other at a university of all places, there's no hope for the future generation of leaders. The late great archaeological thinker Bruce Trigger wrote that people easily accept what they want to believe, but demand overwhelming evidence before they accept ideas that they find abhorrent. This applies to everyone, me included. We all have walls that we don't want to look past. We don't want to believe things that we don't like, but we are not entitled to our own facts. College age is a common age for young adults to radicalize, as their search for belonging often exceeds their due diligence on topics that come to rally behind. A professor friend of mine told me that it's the job of undergrads to make mistakes. I said yes, and it's the job of professors to correct them, to teach them. Without that last part, there is no point to higher education. So here's a question. Should the spread of misinformation be given the sanctuary of academic freedom? Should hatred and calls for violence be protected under academic freedom? The Institutional Review Board, the IRB, has guidelines on ethical research practices, and I quote, "Publication of results is sometimes used incorrectly as an indicator that a project meets the definition of research. It is the intent of the project that matters," end quote. If the intent is pushing a political agenda, that does not qualify as research. If the classroom space is used not as a tool of education, inquiry, and tolerance, but as a way to reify previously held beliefs, it is not education. If students treat the university as a space to recruit radicals and silence dissent, isn't it our responsibility to encourage them to consider another way to live in a civil society? Or should we let them call the shots? Here's an example. Typically groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, and Faculty for Justice in Palestine take an atrocity that their allies in Hamas or Iran have committed against Jews and flip it around, instead falsely accusing Israel and Jews of the same atrocity in order to gain propaganda value. Here in a poster glorifying the Hamas murderers and rapists as martyrs, there are two telling pieces of misinformation. One mentions the Al-Ahli hospital hoax, a claim that more than 500 Palestinians were killed intentionally by Israel in a hospital strike. In reality, a failed terrorist rocket launched from nearby hit the hospital parking lot. Hamas reported it as an Israeli strike that leveled the hospital, and major media outlets obliged to launder their lies. The New York Times, upon investigating, published a retraction. The poster also says this event that did not happen was the single bloodiest massacre in Palestine since 1948. This statement parallels the wording that Jewish groups have been using to describe October 7th, the largest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. So we see here in one poster next to the Illini Union a glorification of terrorism, a hoax, and a blood libel against Israel that mimics Jewish expression of its own trauma. And everybody has trauma, right? But we need to stick to the facts when we're discussing this trauma. Here's another example from our campus. In the charter of the UIUC FJP, professors here call on faculty to normalize discrimination and overturn democracy in order to bring about Palestinian liberation. These 2 points in particular should be extremely troubling for members of an American campus community. First, point 11, they reject civility and, I quote, democratic values. Second, point 12, they urge faculty to do this through the outright discrimination of Jews. They advise faculty to decline service obligations that might put them in the same room or same committee with genocidaires, by which they mean Zionist Jews and presumably all Israeli Jews. Even if they only mean Israelis, which would be a generous reading, this is an overt call for discrimination based on national origin, illegal. Furthermore, what would happen if the university allows for faculty members to pick and choose which service obligations they want because working with someone they disagree with makes them uncomfortable? University service as we know it would crumble. My colleague Carrie Nelson and I published a response to this charter in the journal Fathom in February. We don't call for cancel culture to come to these professors, although one can reasonably ask, why hasn't it? But rather seek to highlight the damage and danger posed by such views, because when people stop talking to each other, that's when the violence starts. We're left with the impression that the only next step beyond what the UIUC FJP is asking for in their charter is violent conflict. And as of last week, they've been delivering just that. So far, we've addressed abuses of academic freedom by students and faculty. What about an entire field? Here's an example. A group of hundreds of classicists, ancient historians, and archaeologists, in short, my colleagues at other universities, published an open letter entitled Letter of Solidarity with the People of Palestine, wherein they commit themselves to a polemic that includes several misleading, non-factual, and ahistorical pronouncements. For example, they called the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 unlawful, ignoring that the Jewish state was sanctioned by the historic 1947 United Nations General Assembly vote in Resolution 181-2. Where they would expect to find stronger legal authenticity than that is truly puzzling. They place the blame for the current Gaza war and the unfolding human tragedy on the Gazan population squarely on Israel, without mentioning the Hamas-led murder, rape, torture, decapitation, and burning of around 1,200 people, as well as the abduction of over 250 hostages from several countries on October 7th, the vast majority of them unarmed civilians, with some 130 still held today in the tunnels of Gaza, or Hamas's use of Gazan civilians as human shields, or in a shocking double standard, the fact that Egypt will not permit a single civilian refugee through its gates, even while Europe was shamed into taking every single refugee from the Syrian civil war who could get there. They would call this a biased or decontextualized approach to data for any other case study. Whereas the United States officials have praised Israel's self-defense strategy as exceeding moral standards in the protection of non-combatant lives, with one American general saying it will rewrite the humanitarian standard for urban warfare moving forward, with the lowest urban warfare collateral damage to civilians on record, with fewer than one civilian dying for every bomb dropped. That's based on both Palestinian and Israeli figures. And whereas even official Palestinian statistics estimate a 10-fold population increase since 1948, the signatories call it genocide. But the sentence that stands out the most, given the signatories' purported expertise, is the following. We further renounce the use of the methods of our fields, especially archaeological practices by Zionist movements, which attempt to falsify a historical claim to the land by laundering its antiquity. In other words, the signatories assert that Jews have no ancient or historic connection to the land of Israel, and intimate that Zionists, here a dog whistle for Jewish archaeologists, have faked any data that would prove it. But they're simply wrong. Saying Jews are indigenous to Israel is like saying Athenians are indigenous to Greece and Romans came from Italy. This is objectively uncontroversial. In fact, ancient Israel is one of the most well-researched cultures from the archaeological, historical, scientific, and genetic standpoints. In addition to the examples I gave before, inscriptions recovered from well-dated contexts mention King David, King Hezekiah, and dozens of other biblical figures that confirm it, as does a mountain of archaeological evidence. In fact, even early Muslim writers of the Quran affirmed Jewish indigeneity in Israel, insisting in Surahs Al-Ma'idah 5:20-21 and Al-Isra 17:104 that the Holy Land is promised to the children of Israel and the people of Moses. These are just a few examples of what the signatories call a, quote, false historical narrative, end quote. So what is their response to facts like these? Zionists have made up all the data. It's simply nonsense. But they didn't come up with it on their own. There is a time-honored tradition of writing the Jews out of history. It began when Aryan ideologues of the 19th century tried to erase ancient Northwest Semitic contributions to Western civilization, particularly those of the Phoenicians to classical Greece, because of their close relationship with the Israelites, contradicting the ancient Greek writers themselves. More recently, Nadia Abu al-Hajj, in her book Facts on the Ground, took a novel approach when the data did not support her beliefs. The Jews have no claim to the geographic area called Palestine. Confronted with all the relentless evidence to the contrary, she dismissed the very concept of facts in order to deny the legitimacy of any Jewish connection to Israel, as Aaron Mayer and others have shown. Modern scholars still labor to debunk these anti-Semitic and racist myths, while Columbia rewarded her with tenure. Such scholarly misinformation has enabled a set of closely related and widely debunked conspiracy theories, including temple denialism, which rejects any Jewish connection to Jerusalem, the myth that Ashkenazi Jews are not descended from the ancient Israelites, but rather the medieval Khazars, debunked, and Holocaust denial. Truther-style denials of the Hamas-led attacks of October 7th, recast as a staged Israeli false flag operation, are now added to this mix, despite the terrorists themselves documenting their brutalities extensively. On campuses across the country, including ours, posters calling to attention the hostages held in Gaza are ripped down again and again against university codes of conduct. They even ripped down pictures of this captive, the baby Kfir Bibas, who is still in some tunnel in Gaza if he's not already dead. By willfully ignoring data in order to make a political point, these signatories have abdicated their scholarly integrity. Their agenda is clear. Namely, Jewish indigeneity is inconvenient to them because it renders the frequent labeling of the state of Israel as a settler colony absurd. How can a people colonize their own homeland? Hence, one of their cornerstone myths would be demolished. Rather, it already has been again and again and again, but they refuse to accept it. Instead, they continue to push that Jews are not ancestral to Israel, so have no right to be there. As if, even if this were true, such a reality would condone rape and violent genital mutilation as legitimate strategies of resistance. These are some of the, quote, events, end quote, of October 7th that the signatories call, quote, not unprovoked, end quote. To anti-Zionists, Israeli Jews are always to blame, always the aggressors, and never the victims. By existing, they were asking for it. Would the signatories be so callous if non-Jewish women and girls were raped and mutilated? Such misogynistic double standards have no place in the academy or anywhere else. So it seems that Hamas and their campus allies want to make indigeneity a competition. They rely on lies and hoaxes and propaganda, such as those hundreds of these signatories help spread. But for those of us in the room and watching who care about facts, there are two reasons why the long-term strategy of Hamas and its allies is unwise. First, perhaps as scholars of decolonization, we should re-envision indigeneity not as a competition, but as a recognition that history often involves multiple groups of people with competing claims to the same land. As scholars of the past, it is our duty to faithfully record all of these interactions, whether we like them or not. Once historians wade into the muck of conspiracy theories, willfully or ignorantly discarding facts because it does not suit their political agenda, they forfeit their status as scholars and become propagandists. Again, no wonder the public trust in higher education and in the humanities and social sciences in particular has eroded so deeply. Second, join me for a thought experiment. Should indigeneity be a competition? Because if they want to make it so, they will lose. Although information like this is often suppressed, Palestine is not mentioned a single time in the Quran. Outside of the Arabian Peninsula, in the Middle East, Arabs and Muslims, known as the Ummah, are the very definition of settler colonists. They invaded and conquered the Levant and Middle East from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century AD, 500 years after the Romans ethnically cleansed Israel of Jews in the Bar Kokhba or Second Jewish Revolt, and 1,700 years after the formation of the Israelite dynasties based out of Jerusalem. In the processes of imperial Islamic expansion, displaced indigenous peoples were either forced into conversion, killed for being infidels, or granted second-class citizenship. Despite the fact that some of the Arab colonists would have married with locals, soon any pre-Islamic or pre-Arab identity was discarded. Now, in one of the most successful and vile campaigns of misinformation to write the Jews out of history, it is fashionable to call only the descendants of the Arab conquerors indigenous, excluding the Jews from their original connection to the land. This inconvenient truth is the reason that they revile Zionism and cynically use language of decolonization to discredit it. Does such a race to the bottom competition over land really belong on campus? Because the goal of such a competition is not diversity, equity, or inclusion, it is exclusion. So what to do? Let's be scholars. Let's take it a step further. The following is the appropriate message on a university campus to form a basis for discussion. The Arabs are in the Middle East now, along with all the other indigenous peoples they conquered: Jews, Copts, Yazidis, Maronites, Assyrians, Kurds, Amazigh. There are Armenians, Greeks, Persians, Turks, and others. No one is going anywhere, nor should there be calls for eradication of countries or peoples. So we must face facts, platform measured discussions, find ways to coexist, or at least talk about how that would look, and make it clear that hysterical pro-jihad voices that privilege bigotry and propaganda and calls for violence are not welcome. As we saw last week, these are not just calls for violence from our campus and others, but actual violence as well. Take what they're saying seriously. It's not just rhetoric. If we can't even talk about these things on campus, where in the world can we talk about them? But since these abuses of academic freedom have gone unchecked, should we then be surprised to find that a December Harvard CAP Harris poll found 51% of 18 to 24-year-olds believe that the Jewish state of Israel should be, quote, ended, end quote, and replaced with a Hamas-run government? Look no further than American classrooms to understand why. What can administrators do in the face of such clear abuses of truth? This brings us to another question. Should Jews, like other minority groups, get to define what discrimination against them looks like? Who gets to define discrimination? Let's look at 3 cases where faculty members, while harshly criticizing the Jewish state, also believe they have the right to define anti-Semitism. In other words, while using anti-Semitic speech as defined by most Jews, they have the nerve to tell those Jews, you're wrong, we are the ones who get to define anti-Semitism, and it doesn't include calls for the erasure of the only Jewish state where half the world's Jews live. Let's have a look at that statement by the classicist and archaeologist again, which included another assertion. We reject each and every effort to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Next, 2 NYU professors writing for the New York Times wrote, to be clear, we abhor all expressions of anti-Semitism and wholeheartedly reject any role for anti-Semitism on our campuses. Equally, we believe that conflating criticism of Israel or Zionism with anti-Semitism is dangerous. How extraordinarily disingenuous of them. Did they ask any of their Jewish students about the danger they feel walking around New York City? Because the dangers facing Jewish students on campus are coming from anti-Zionists. And here from our own campus, we also condemn anti-Semitism and the erasure of a rich tradition of Jewish critique that refuses the conflation of Judaism with Zionism. In that same departmental statement, not my own, these same faculty members also say, quote, we are committed to critical, if sometimes difficult, discussions about the historical context of Israel's ongoing genocide, end quote. So even the notoriously biased World Court has not yet issued a verdict over South Africa's politicized genocide case against Israel, but these professors have. They also call Israel a settler colony, a conspiracy theory that we already debunked today. We may put aside for a moment the general propriety of a department issuing a political statement. My colleagues Carrie Nelson and Jacob Dalal will touch on this in greater detail later. But for now, does anyone really think that tenured faculty who push an opinion are not abusing their power over untenured or non-tenure stream faculty, grad students, undergrads, and staff by issuing statements on their behalf, as if they would entertain dissent, as if an assistant professor would push back without worrying about their career and financial future? One can easily imagine a chill on academic freedom and scenarios of workplace discrimination and retaliation unfolding. Universities should see departmental statements as clear liabilities, and rightly so. We can also see what kind of ideologies they are pushing. After swastikas were painted on campus and Jewish fraternities and sororities were attacked, A faculty member from one of these signatory departments took angrily to the U of I Faculty Senate floor to say that swastikas are not necessarily signs of hatred against Jews, and the university should not treat this as an anti-Semitic act. This fits within a pattern of denying Jews any status of victimhood, allowing for Jews as victims would fly in the face of traditional far-left orthodoxy, as our speaker, Anna Warshay, will touch upon later today in her talk. I'm a post-colonial scholar who has embraced diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, in all of my research, teaching, and service. I'm sensitive and sympathetic to the rights of underprivileged and historically disenfranchised minorities and class groups, and I strive to be ever more so. By common principles of DEI, the oppressed group has the right to define what discrimination against their group looks like, and no one else, certainly not the groups who are doing the discriminating. Such statements betray other double standards in the ethical best practices these faculty members should have learned in how to treat persecuted descendant communities. For any other modern stakeholders of cultural heritage, my colleagues would attack even the slightest hint of encroachment by any outsider denying their rights of sovereignty, self-defense, and self-determination, or their own definitions of what discrimination against them entails. This is what chancelleries of DEI have taught us. What right do all of these people and institutions have to define anti-Semitism? Do they feel entitled to impose their own terms of discrimination on other oppressed minorities, or just on Jews, just on a group they falsely accuse of genocide? So when you have a violent, bloodthirsty mob masked in keffiyehs attacking an Israeli speaker at Berkeley, or here on our own campus with SJP using the Hamas terrorist paragliders as a symbol, not only do these so-called scholars deny that this is anti-Semitism, they also want to grant that mob the right to define what Jew hatred is. Taking positions such as these threatens to condemn the entire post-colonial project and the entire DEI world as meaningless. This would be a shame. So much ground has been covered and so much improvements have been made in its name. Those of you who also believe in removing colonial attitudes from campus should join me in pushing for major reform how DEI is practiced. To put this in a familiar context, it reminds me of the popular debate over the Confederate flag. Who decides whether the Confederate flag is a symbol of racism or a legitimate marker of Southern white pride? Descendants of enslaved black Americans or the Ku Klux Klan? Is it valid for a Southern white person to tell a black person that the Confederate flag is exclusively a symbol of Southern pride, that they are wrong to see it as a sign of slavery, that they ignore the rich tradition of Confederate pride in doing so? By DEI orthodoxy, of course not. The argument for Southern pride would be rejected, since the sensitivities of black people are all that matter as the oppressed group, as it should be. By gaslighting Jews as stakeholders who equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionist rallying cries for the violent eradication of just a single nation state, then we see that it is my colleagues themselves who have become the colonizers. Many proponents of the boycott, divestment, and sanction, or BDS movement against Israel claim they aren't anti-Semitic. Next time you hear that, please ask them this. Would Israeli Arab professors also be subject to the boycott, or just Israeli Jews? So what about the mainstream Jewish voice that equates anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism? We do not want special treatment, we just ask for equal treatment. But the fact that there is unequal application of these principles to protected versus disfavored minorities renders the entire approach hypocritical, irrelevant, and either doomed to fail, or if it persists, to create an undemocratic society with protections for some and discrimination for others. This brings us to our next question. Is the goal of higher education to equip students to think for themselves based on widely accepted facts, to challenge their preconceived notions, or is it to abide by dogmatic axioms? What damage is done to students, Jewish and other, when faculty in the classroom favor pushing a political agenda over objective presentation of facts? Students who don't leave open space for new facts, new methods, new ideas, what's the point of spending so much money and time on a degree? But it's not only your fault, it is the fault of faculty members who choose to use their classroom to push political agendas, who abuse their position of authority and abuse your hard-earned dollars by subverting academic freedom to do anything other than teach you facts. Because a dear friend of mine who was a hippie radical in the streets of New York City in the late 1960s, and who later went on to build bridges with people across the political and ideological spectrum, once said to me that over the years he learned that 3, 4, 5 people can be presented with the same set of facts and come away with 3, 4, or 5 different interpretations. What a better way to sum up the ideal situation in a university. a place where all fact-based claims and truths can be put forward without suppressions. Is it too loud? Too fast. And debated vehemently. But the problem today is twofold. One, there is no more civil discourse on campus. Extremism and propaganda have been normalized. As an undergrad, I was co-head of the Brandeis-Wellesley Arab-Jewish Dialogue Group. It's hard to imagine such a body functioning today. Some faculty members in the humanities and social sciences, and therefore the students they train, are largely unable to entertain opinions that do not align with their beliefs. Recall that trigger quote above. 2, facts do not rule the campus. Even the belief in truth, or the very existence of facts, or basic tenets of good and evil, are not only questioned in a theoretical way, but are rejected. This is nothing more than authoritarianism in liberal candy wrapping. Conspiracy theories, hoaxes, and misinformation, propaganda, intolerance, exclusion, and echo chambers are being taught in our classrooms to push political agendas. Case in point, a student of mine, Ezra Landman-Fagelson, who is also assisting me today with the conference, came to me with a question in October. What do I do when I see my classmates shouting the genocidal phrase, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," or when they're being honest, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab," meaning to ethnically cleanse all Jews from Israel? I said, first, don't put yourself in danger. And only if you feel it's safe enough, ask them, which river? Ezra went and did this and recorded his interactions with a student who, unsurprisingly, had no idea which river, and perhaps even worse than their ignorance, claimed it did not matter which river. In all, last time we checked, his video has been viewed over 3.5 million times across social media platforms. A month later, Berkeley professor Ron Hessner conducted a survey asking undergrads across the US, which river? Of the students who support the slogan, less than half, only 47%, even knew which river. By the way, it's this river and this sea, all of Israel. As Professor Hessner put it, there's no shame in being ignorant unless one is screaming for the extermination of millions. Now, here's the crucial part for us educators. Professor Hessner included a brief tutorial for the students. Once they saw the map and understood what it meant, 68% went from supporting From the River to the Sea to rejecting the mantra. 68% changed their minds when they finally saw the facts. Such is the power of indoctrination, but such too is the power of education. Students, don't come to campus with your brains already full. Leave space open for new facts, methods, and ideas, and I can learn from you too. But beyond faculty and students, what role do university administrators play? Are university administrators able to differentiate between disfavored and protected minorities? There is a public debate whether or not DEI initiatives are part of the problem. The argument, which I didn't come up with, goes something like this. What began as a truly noble cause of attempting to correct historical injustices for individuals from underprivileged and indigenous groups has morphed into the campus thought police, controlling every aspect of hiring, training, tenure, and PR, all on dubious legal grounds. Much of my own research, teaching, and service has involved equitable, consultative, and collaborative work with indigenous and underprivileged groups. I believe in this, and I'm proud to continue it. But an honest discussion regarding the pitfalls of a race-based approach while occurring in the media and in partisan fights is largely missing from campus. Let's assume for a moment that a focus on race and colonialism that has led to hatred and overt discrimination of Jews in Israel does not stem from DEI philosophies themselves or how they're practiced. Is it not, in any case, the responsibility of DEI administrators to condemn such behaviors? To condemn hatred of Jews and Israelis as antithetical to DEI norms? To condemn the weaponization of the Holocaust against Jews? So whether or not the way DEI is being practiced has been part of the problem, which is a discussion that needs to be had, perched as it is at the center of all campus messaging, it is to blame for letting it fester. The DEI philosophy of inclusion, by assigning privileges to only some races or ethnicities and allowing for the denunciation of others, has ironically become one of the most exclusive approaches to campus life. And it is Zionist Jews and Israelis who are now in the crosshairs more than anyone. Progressive students and student organizations who hold Zionist beliefs are being shunned and ejected from spaces on campuses all across the US, and it's been happening for years, long before October 7th. We often trumpet the benefits of DEI, and there are many, but for it to stay relevant and credible, we must allow an honest discussion about the disadvantages of a race-based approach to higher education. Because as we have seen over the past several months, it has led to races being pitted against each other. Furthermore, DEI committees against anti-Semitism have popped up across the country, often stocked with openly anti-Israel faculty, for balance. Should a committee tasked with confronting violence against black campus members be stocked with white supremacists for the sake of balance? Of course not. So for Jews, this is both sidesism at its most insincere. DEI administrators should indeed establish committees on anti-Semitism and then remove themselves from the selection process, leaving it solely to the mainstream Jewish organizations and the local Jewish community. To put it plainly, Jewish faculty and students simply ask that a connection to their homeland is not criminalized on campus. In conclusion, a colleague asked me why I designed this conference without focusing only on right-wing anti-Semitism, meaning threats against Jews from neo-Nazis and white supremacists as opposed to jihadists and Islamists. I told them because this has already been widely researched. Right-wing anti-Semitism is extremely dangerous too, but it's not new, at least not in the US, not like left-wing anti-Semitism has become. What was interesting to me was their assumption, because I never wrote it anywhere. It must have been clear to this colleague that the new anti-Semitism is coming from the far left wing of the political spectrum. And as such, many people on campus refuse to accept that it's a problem at all, because how could we be the ones letting anti-Semitism fester? No, they say, it's just hatred of Israelis or Jews who identify as Zionists. And apparently that hatred is okay with them. Apparently discrimination is justified in certain circumstances, such as when the victim deserves it. This is not a political gathering, but they were correct. It was a good point. Right-wing anti-Semitism is an old, hugely researched field, and there is still much to say about it. But left-wing anti-Semitism is a burgeoning, newer field that is just starting to be tackled, with many scholars and journalists embracing it and seeking data. But faculty don't like it when they themselves are being researched. The university is supposed to be a space for reflective thought for society, measured discourse following admission of facts. But if we can't even question ourselves, how can we teach students? It's real and it's a worry, but the problem with modern anti-Semitism is that it is growing here at home, on campuses, on our campus, and the response is to tell Jews that we're wrong to be upset because it's all Israel's fault, not Hamas, not Egypt, for trapping all the Gazans in Gaza, not Iran for funding terrorism, not Qatar for sheltering Hamas, not the United Nations for giving up their headquarters as terrorist bases, and with their textbooks instructing children that their goal in life should be to get martyred, murdering Jews. And most importantly, not our own faculty who have normalized hatred and violence against Jews. No, just Israel, a place where gay Palestinians flee their own oppressive society and are granted asylum, or the US, which gives you the freedoms to call for intifada revolution even against it, which protects the morally depraved labeling of Jews as the new Nazis perpetrating a new Holocaust, to allow for faculty to call for both the destruction of a sovereign nation state and for violence against Jews without any professional consequences. It is willful ignorance, it is gaslighting, it is anti-Semitic, it is an abuse of academic freedom. Their hatred of America and disingenuousness is ironically protected by the First Amendment, but we don't have to listen to them or be pressured to platform them, and we must be allowed to push back. That's the point of this conference. Is it too simple to call this outpouring of hatred against Jews anti-Semitism alone? Perhaps. Many people on campus who have nothing to do with the Middle East, either personally or professionally, can be seen screaming for intifada, ripping down posters of kidnapped babies, and calling for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Israel. There are other reasons beyond Jews shattering the dream of global Islamist empire that can explain the vigor with which Westerners have taken up this mantle. For example, a misplaced sense of white guilt channeled against Jews, or ignorance combined with a desire to do the right thing and jump on the loudest bandwagon without fact-checking, or a valid fear of Islamism and jihad, or a misguided attempt at decolonization. These are some of the sources that lead to hatred against Jews, but do not spring from anti-Semitism. But the end result is the same. It is easier to let Jew hatred grow than to stand up against supporters of terrorism out of fear of being mislabeled a racist or Islamophobe. Fear and ignorance can indeed lead to hatred or inaction, but ignorance is no excuse, and that is nowhere more true than on university campuses. Thank you very much.